You wake up 14,700 years ago inside a cave in what is now southwest England. The fire is low. Reindeer bones lie near the wall. Someone reaches toward you and offers a cup. It is smooth, carefully shaped, and made from the top of a human skull. There is no handle. There is also no customer service department. The obvious explanation is that prehistoric people were desperate, brutal, and apparently terrible at choosing tableware. But that explanation falls apart almost immediately. The skulls found at Gough's cave were not random broken heads grabbed during some Ice Age emergency. They were deliberately cleaned, carefully cut, struck in controlled places, and chipped around the edges until the remaining cranial vault formed a surprisingly regular vessel. The same human remains also carry cut marks, percussion damage, and tooth marks left by humans. So, were these skulls trophies taken from enemies? Sacred objects made from relatives? Containers used during funerals? Or the final stage of a ritual in which eating the dead was not an act of starvation, but a way of dealing with death itself? The answer involves microscopic knife marks, an engraved human bone, and one deeply uncomfortable possibility. Mourning, memory, and consumption were not always separate things. Let's go back to the cave. The short answer is that these skull cups were probably part of a deliberate way of treating the dead. That answer is useful. It is also dangerously vague. Archaeologists use the word ritual when an action is repeated, structured, and seems to carry meaning beyond simple survival. But ritual is not a magic label that turns every strange object into a sacred one. Sometimes a bowl is just a bowl. Sometimes a skull shaped like a bowl is where the problems begin. At Gough's cave, 3 human cranial vaults were processed in remarkably similar ways. Soft tissue was removed. The face and base of each skull were broken away. The remaining edges were then carefully trimmed. These objects date to roughly 14,700 years ago and are the earliest directly dated examples currently identified as skull cups. So, we know the shape was intentional. We can strongly infer that the objects belong to a wider sequence of handling, butchering, and consuming human remains. What we cannot recover is the final instruction manual. We do not know whether people drank from them, placed food inside them, displayed them, carried them during a ceremony, or used them only once. Archaeology can identify a cut made thousands of years ago. It cannot recover the prehistoric drinks menu. And this creates the real mystery. Ice Age people could work wood, hide, antler, and animal bone. They did not need a human head simply to hold something. The important question is not why they made a container. It is why the container had to remain recognizably human. Before we ask what the skull meant, we need to understand why it worked so well as an object. The upper part of the human skull already has the basic geometry of a bowl. It is curved, hollow, rigid, and large enough to hold material. Nature had done the first stage of manufacturing. Evolution did not include the handle. But turning a head into a usable vessel still required considerable work. The face projected forward. The base of the skull was thick and uneven. Muscles, skin, eyes, tongue, and other tissues had to be removed. The unwanted sections then had to be separated without destroying the cranial vault. Finally, the broken rim could be chipped into a more regular edge. So the skull offered convenience, but not simplicity. And there is another reason the head mattered. A thigh bone is part of a person. A skull still resembles a person. The face is where humans search for recognition, emotion, age, health, and intention. Even after the face has disappeared, the skull preserves the shape of the head and the spaces where the eyes once looked back. That does not prove. The people at Gough's cave believed the skull contained a soul, a personality, or an ancestor. We cannot recover their exact ideas about identity, but choosing the head was not socially neutral. Every human community must solve the same biological problem. A living person becomes a body that changes rapidly. The group must decide whether to bury it, burn it, expose it, preserve it, divide it, or transform it. At Gough's cave, transformation appears to have been the answer, which leaves us with a harder question. Was this mainly an efficient use of the body, or did the transformation itself carry meaning? The conventional explanation is simple. Ice Age life was brutal. Food disappeared, and starving people ate whoever was available. It is not an absurd hypothesis. Human tissue contains calories. Long bones hold marrow and fat, and the brain is energy-rich. Under extreme conditions, people in many periods have consumed human bodies because the alternative was death. Late glacial Britain was cold, unstable, and not known for reliable grocery delivery. But the Gough's cave evidence refuses to fit neatly inside a starvation story. The cave also contained large quantities of butchered animal remains. These people hunted, processed carcasses, worked reindeer antler, and used animal bone as both food and raw material. That does not prove they were enjoying permanent abundance. Those animal bones could represent meals from different visits, and even skilled hunters sometimes failed. Still, human bodies were not treated like an emergency snack discovered after every reindeer had vanished. The processing was extensive and repeated. Flesh was removed. Joints were separated. Long bones were broken open. Human teeth left impressions on some fragments. Then, after edible tissues could already have been extracted, selected skulls received additional work to produce regular cranial vessels. That final stage matters. If hunger were the only objective, there was no nutritional reward for carefully trimming the broken rim of an empty skull. Calories do not improve when the container becomes symmetrical. The strongest interpretation is therefore not that food played no role. Human tissue was almost certainly consumed. It is that consumption belonged to a larger, culturally organized treatment of the dead. This was not automatically a prehistoric refrigerator-empty emergency. And if starvation cannot explain the complete sequence, we need evidence that can reconstruct what people actually did one cut, fracture, and tooth mark at a time. And this is where the skull stops being an object and becomes a sequence. Archaeologists often use the French term chaîne opératoire, the chain of actions that turns raw material into a finished object. Normally, that might describe how someone made a stone blade. At Gough's cave, the raw material was a human head. The first step was separating the head from the body. Stone tools then removed the scalp and the soft tissues attached to the skull. Cut marks cluster around areas where skin, muscles, and other tissues had to be detached. The face was deliberately separated from the brain case. Next came controlled breakage. Blows were placed around the facial bones, the sides of the skull, and the base. The head was probably supported against an anvil while a hammerstone removed the sections that projected outward or made the object unstable. The goal was to preserve most of the rounded cranial vault while eliminating almost everything below it. Then the broken edge was chipped. This is the detail that changes the story. A skull smashed open for access to the brain, usually fragments across the vault. At Gough's cave, the vaults remained unusually complete. Small blows followed their lower margins, removing irregular projections and producing a more continuous rim. This was not 5 minutes of enthusiastic smashing. How can anyone know that after nearly 15,000 years? Because damage has patterns. A stone tool cut tends to leave a narrow groove with a characteristic cross-section. A percussion blow creates pits, cracks, and fracture surfaces in predictable locations. Soil pressure, trampling, weathering, and excavation damage leave different signatures. One mark proves little. Hundreds arranged around muscles, joints, sutures, and edges can reconstruct an order of operations. And the order matters. The people performing this work were not merely trying to reach edible tissue as quickly as possible. They cleaned the skull extensively, removed selected anatomical regions, preserved the vault, and then shaped what remained. Multiple skulls went through broadly similar treatment. The evidence is powerful, but limited. It shows hands, tools, choices, and sequence. It does not reveal the words spoken nearby, the relationship between the living and the dead, or whether the finished object ever held blood, water, food, pigment, or nothing at all. Which raises a stranger possibility. Perhaps the finished cup was only part of the purpose. Perhaps the transformation itself was the event. Now widen the frame. Gough's cave is a large limestone cave opening into Cheddar Gorge in southwest England. Around 14,700 years ago, Magdalenian hunter-gatherers used the site during a relatively brief period. They left stone tools, worked antler, portable art, animal bones, and remains from at least 6 people. The human remains were not placed in neat graves. They lay among butchered animal bones, fragmented and heavily modified. More than 65% carried cut marks consistent with disarticulation, scalping, or removing muscle. About 35% showed percussion damage associated with extracting marrow and grease. Researchers identified human tooth marks on 87 postcranial fragments. In other words, the skull cups were not isolated curiosities sitting politely in a corner. They belonged to the processing of entire bodies. And then one forearm bone complicated the story even further. A human radius had been filleted. It carried tooth marks. It had been struck and later broken for marrow. But along one side ran a deliberate zigzag pattern about 6 centimeters long. The lines could have been more butchery marks. Researchers compared them with hundreds of filleting cuts and engraved animal bone objects from the cave. Under three-dimensional microscopy, the zigzags showed a different combination of strokes. Repeated sawing motions, scraping, and controlled incisions arranged into a regular design. The bone had not merely been processed. It had been engraved. The sequence appears especially important. The flesh was removed first. The design was cut while the bone was still largely intact. Only afterward was it broken to reach the marrow. That means the same human limb could move through several categories in a single event: body, food, surface for art, and source of fat. Modern minds prefer clean boundaries. Dinner belongs in one room, funerals in another, and art safely behind glass. At Gough's cave, those boundaries may never have existed in the same form, which raises the question we can no longer avoid. If eating and engraving belonged to one sequence, what was the sequence actually for? So what was the entire sequence probably for? The most honest answer has 3 layers, and they may have happened at the same time. The first was physical extraction. Human bodies contain muscle, fat, marrow, and organs. The cut marks, fractured long bones, and tooth impressions at Gough's cave show that edible tissues were removed, and at least some were consumed. Whatever else the event meant, the body was being used as a material resource. The second layer was the treatment of the dead. These remains were not abandoned, buried intact, or destroyed without a pattern. Entire bodies passed through a repeated sequence of dismemberment, defleshing, consumption, engraving, and selective preservation. That suggests a recognized mortuary practice, a culturally understood method for moving someone from living person to processed remains. Consumption did not necessarily mean contempt. Human societies have developed radically different ideas about what proper treatment of the dead should look like. The third layer was the production of an object. A cranial vault could physically hold many kinds of material. It could also have been displayed or handled without containing anything. No surviving residue tells us what, if anything, was placed inside the Gough's cave skull cups. And this is where modern categories become unhelpful. We want one folder labeled food, another labeled funeral, and a third labeled symbolism. Ancient behavior did not organize itself for the convenience of museum databases. Eating the body may have transformed it. Engraving the bone may have marked that transformation. Shaping the skull may have preserved one selected part after the rest was consumed. The cup was practical enough to function, but its material ensured that it could never be ordinary. And the same unusual choice appears beyond Gough's cave. Across Magdalenian Western Europe, archaeologists have found other human cranial fragments bearing combinations of cut marks, controlled breakage, and modified edges. 2 of the clearest comparisons come from Le Placard and Isteritz, both in France, at Le Placard. Fragments from several skulls show evidence that soft tissue was removed before the cranial vaults were broken and shaped. At Isteritz, human skull fragments also preserve cut marks and modifications consistent with producing bowl-like objects. The resemblance does not mean that one identical ceremony was performed everywhere. There was no Magdalenian skull cup franchise issuing standardized instructions from cave to cave, but the repeated choice is significant. Different communities, separated by considerable distances, were selecting the same part of the body, preserving its curved upper vault, and modifying it into a similar form. That suggests the technique, or at least the idea behind it, could be learned, remembered, and transmitted. Still, we need to keep the map honest. Most Magdalenian sites have not produced skull cups. Not every human bone with cut marks belonged to cannibalism, and not every broken cranium was intended to become a vessel. Prehistoric humans did not all share one enormous Ice Age funeral tradition. The behavior may truly have been rare, or much of its evidence may have been removed, destroyed, or never recovered. What survives is a small and stubborn sample. But when the same unusual sequence appears in several places, the skull cup stops looking like one group's improvisation. It begins to look like cultural knowledge. And once an object becomes shared knowledge, it can start communicating something to everyone who understands the rules. Once a skull cup became part of shared cultural knowledge, it could do more than hold material. It could communicate. A human skull is never neutral in the way a wooden bowl might be. It comes from a specific body. It once carried a face, a voice, and a place within a group. Even when the individual identity was no longer visible, everyone involved would have understood that the object had been made from a person. That fact could give the vessel several possible meanings. It may have kept the dead physically present among the living. It may have turned an individual into a focus of collective memory or group identity. If the person came from outside the group, the same object could instead have signaled victory, danger, or control. These possibilities are not interchangeable, and archaeology cannot tell us which one applied at Gough's cave. What matters is that the skull's power came from shared understanding. Enter the cave without knowing the rules. A modified human cranium near the fire is unsettling, but silent. Now, imagine that you grew up watching elders prepare the dead in the same way, hearing the same stories, and seeing the same object appear during particular gatherings. The vessel would no longer need an explanation. Its meaning would already be carried by the group. That is how practical behavior becomes social language. Humans do this constantly. We turn rings, uniforms, flags, scars, and pieces of metal into statements about belonging, authority, memory, or loss. The material is only part of the message. The skull cup may have marked belonging, shaped how the dead were remembered, or expressed how the living understood their relationship to them. But calling the act meaningful does not automatically make it gentle. The same object could express care, fear, domination, obligation, or several of these at once. There is a danger in making this story too elegant. Once we hear words like mortuary, ritual, memory, and symbolism, it becomes tempting to imagine a solemn ceremony in which every action expressed respect for the dead. The bones do not allow that comfortable conclusion. Human flesh was removed. Long bones were broken for marrow and grease. Some fragments were chewed. The skulls were cleaned and reshaped only after the bodies had been intensively processed. This was cannibalism. But that word creates its own distortion. Modern audiences often hear it and immediately imagine chaos, cruelty, or people driven beyond civilization by hunger. The evidence at Gough's cave points instead toward repeated, organized behavior. Organized does not mean peaceful. Ritual does not mean compassionate. It only means that the actions followed culturally understood rules. We do not know who the dead were. They may have belonged to the same community. They may have come from another group. They could have died naturally, violently, or under circumstances that left no readable trace on the surviving bones. The skull cups might have preserved valued people, humiliated enemies, or served a purpose that fits neither category. That uncertainty matters. Calling the practice savage would reduce complex behavior to disgust. Calling it beautiful would turn damaged bodies into a comforting story that the evidence cannot support. The people at Gough's cave may not have considered consumption and respect to be opposites, nor can we reconstruct whether everyone involved understood or experienced the event in the same way. The skull cup sits between our categories: object and person, food and memory, care and control. And the most honest explanation must leave that discomfort intact. So, why did prehistoric humans turn skulls into cups? The evidence allows a clear answer, but not a simple one. We know that people at Gough's cave deliberately removed soft tissue, broke apart human bodies, extracted marrow and grease, and consumed at least some of the remains. We also know that selected skulls were preserved, reshaped, and finished through a repeated technical sequence. That was not accidental damage. It was not merely the fastest way to reach the brain, and it was probably not ordinary household manufacturing. The strongest interpretation is that skull cups formed part of an organized treatment of the dead in which consumption, bodily transformation, and symbolic action overlapped. The natural shape of the cranium made it useful as a vessel. Its origin in a human head made it socially powerful. Beyond that, certainty ends. We do not know whether these vessels held drink, food, pigment, offerings, or nothing at all. We do not know whether the dead were relatives, enemies, outsiders, or members of the same community. We cannot tell whether the cups were used once, kept for years, displayed, carried, or deliberately abandoned. So, the real answer is not that prehistoric people made cups from skulls because they lacked bowls. They made them because a skull could become both a functional object and the final transformed remains of a person. It could contain material. More importantly, it could contain meaning. You are probably holding or sitting near a cup right now. Ceramic, glass, metal, or plastic. Designed by people who considered handles a major technological achievement. 14,000 years ago, someone at Gough's cave may have held a very different kind of vessel. We cannot know what was placed inside it, whose skull it had been, what words were spoken, or whether it inspired grief, pride, fear, obligation, or all four. But the need behind the transformation may not be entirely foreign. Modern people still alter the remains of the dead. We cremate bodies and preserve the ashes in decorated vessels. We keep hair, jewelry, photographs, clothing, and objects touched by someone who is gone. We turn physical material into something memory can gather around. That does not make a modern urn equivalent to a Magdalenian skull cup. The practices, beliefs, and experiences are separated by an enormous cultural distance. What connects them is more basic. Death removes a person, but humans rarely let that disappearance remain abstract. We bury, burn, preserve, divide, display, carry, name, and remember. We create actions because doing nothing feels impossible. The skull cup still has no handle. There is still no customer service department. But it no longer looks like prehistoric tableware, chosen by people who had run out of better bowls. It looks like the surviving fragment of a system whose rules have vanished. The object remained, the meaning did not, and that may be the most human part of the story.